Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains highly experimental and prone to failure, and today we are going to discuss weapons from World War II specifically that were just that. Some of these did get technically past the experimental stage, but they still didn't do that great at all. They just, it wasn't gonna work. Some of them had some interesting thinking, interesting thought processes, but they didn't work. These are 5 World War II weapons that just didn't work. The Goliath tracked mine, or if you're German, the Leichter Ladungsträger Goliath. I think that's how you pronounce that. My German audience is positively seething as I'm sure I messed something up there. There are actually 2 versions of this thing, the 302 and the 303, and at a glance you might assume this is some kind of tank. Look closer. Actually, just let me show you a better picture. Behold, they are tiny. Interestingly, despite these being German designs, it's actually based off of a French concept. Research and development on a remote-controlled explosive charge that would use tracks to get it across the battlefield actually dates back to World War I. And in late 1940, the Germans actually recovered a French prototype from the battlefield. They immediately ordered the Karl F.W. Borgward Automotive Company of Bremen, Germany, to develop a similar vehicle with the specific purpose to carry a minimum of 50 kilograms, or 110 pounds, of explosives. That would result in the 302, or the Goliath, which actually carried 60 kilograms, or 130 pounds of explosives. It was steered remotely via a joystick control box, but not wirelessly. It was connected to the box via a cable that was 650 meters, or 2,130 feet long. The cable also functioned for transmitting power to the vehicle for the version that was electrically driven. They were built as cheaply as possible since their whole point was to reach their target and explode. But even with that, they were actually pretty expensive each, 3,000 Reichmarks. And if they broke down without exploding, they were actually very annoying to repair. The 303 version actually amended that last problem, given the fact that it was powered by gasoline, which was more familiar to the soldiers that would be managing these. The thing was, even when they were working, they didn't really work very well. They weren't exactly stealthy, and they were actually extremely fragile. They were spotted on the beaches of the Normandy invasion during D-Day, but the vast majority of them were rendered inoperative by artillery blasts, which had a habit of cutting their cables, and without those cables, they were meaningless. It's not like these were drones. You needed the cables in order to move them. They also only moved at 6 kilometers per hour, 3.7 miles per hour, and had terrible ground clearance. Mostly, they just kind of failed at reaching their targets, which meant their high cost was a complete waste of both money and materials. They were pretty effective when they did hit their targets, as the explosions were very good whenever they went off. It's just they never reached their targets, so you do better just to invest in more artillery. A large number of them, because Germany produced over 7,000 of these things, was captured by the Allies, and were examined by them, but they found them to be kind of useless for the same reasons I already told you. Though the US Army Air Force did actually use them as aircraft tugs, as they were powerful enough to do that, but because they were disposable, they quickly broke down as they weren't designed to operate that much, or to pull anything really. Quite a few of these little devils have survived in the preservation, and you can see them in museums all over the world. Project Habakkuk. Man, if I had $1 for every time someone has asked me to talk about this blasted aircraft carrier, I wouldn't need to do these videos anymore, as I'd have enough money to retire. But unfortunately, I don't get paid for just being given ideas. I actually have to, talk about stuff. And here we are. This is a pretty infamous project that there are plenty of videos on YouTube about, but you guys want me to talk about it. It needs to be me? Okay, fine. This was a British idea that is sourced at Geoffrey Pyke, who worked for the Combined Operations Headquarters. Now, if someone just showed you a picture of this thing, you'd probably just think this was a normal aircraft carrier, and that wasn't exactly revolutionary for World War II. Plenty of countries had those. It was what this thing was supposed to be made of, though. They weren't using steel, or even wood. Well, actually, they were kind of using wood, but not in its raw form. It was supposed to be made out of something called pykrete, which is a mixture of wood pulp and ice. Approximately 14% sawdust or wood pulp, and 86% ice. Now, why in the heck would you ever want to do that? Well, for one thing, pykrete is extremely tough, and it has relatively low thermal conductivity, so it actually wouldn't melt that quickly. Geoffrey Pyke was clearly a bit of a free thinker, and his first idea actually involved using a literal iceberg. He thought you could use a literal iceberg, but just flatten the top of it and an aircraft could land on it. I mean, I suppose that's theoretically doable, but is that practical at all? Is kind of my thing. Ice could also be manufactured at just 1% the energy needed to make an equivalent mass of steel. Both it and aluminum were in short supply during World War II for obvious reasons. Plans for the idea actually fell in front of Winston Churchill eventually, and he was pretty enthusiastic about the concept, always willing to entertain an idea for a new effective weapon no matter how crazy it might sound. In early 1942, Max Perutz was called in to determine whether an ice floe that was large enough to withstand Atlantic conditions could be built up fast enough to matter. He pointed out that natural icebergs have too small a surface above the water for an airstrip, and that's pretty true. Also, they were kind of prone to suddenly rolling over in the right conditions, so perhaps not the best choice for making an airfield. But what if they built one from the ground up? Well, that's where pykrete came into it. Like I said, pykrete is strong, doesn't melt very quickly, and it floats. It could also be machined like wood and cast into shapes like metal. Also, when it was immersed in water, it formed an insulating shell of wet wood pulp on its surface that protected the interior from further melting. Perutz's tests showed that a pykrete ship would slowly sag unless it was cooled to -16 degrees Celsius, or 3 degrees Fahrenheit. To accomplish this, the ship's surface would have to be protected by insulation, and it would need to be refrigerated and have a complicated system of ducts. Alright, this sounds way too complicated to be worth it, but they weren't done yet. Perutz proceeded to conduct experiments on the viability of the pykrete and its optimum composition in a secret location underneath Smithfield Meat Market in the city of London. He used a refrigerated meat locker behind a protective screen of frozen animal carcasses. This is ridiculous. I just want to stress that. They made a decision to build a large-scale model of it, and this was going to be done at Jasper National Park in Canada. As you know, Canada is where things go to get very cold all the time. They wanted to test insulation and refrigeration techniques and see how pykrete could stand up to artillery and explosives. The prototype measured 60 by 30 feet, and it weighed 1,000 tons, being kept frozen by a 1-horsepower motor. The Canadians that worked on it were pretty confident about constructing the vessel in time for 1944. The necessary materials they'd require to build a full-size version would be 300,000 tons of wood pulp, 25,000 tons of fiberboard insulation, 35,000 tons of timber, and 10,000 tons of steel. It would cost about 700,000 pounds. But the cold flow issue was actually becoming major, and it was pretty clear that they would need more steel reinforcement to keep the whole thing together, as well as a more effective insulating skin around the vessel's hull. This meant the cost estimate ballooned to 2.5 million pounds. While they were still running tests, requirement creep began to catch up with them. Suddenly the vessel needed to have a range of 7,000 miles, or 11,000 kilometers, and be able to withstand the largest waves recorded. The Admiralty also wanted it to be torpedo-proof, which meant the hull had to be at least 40 feet thick. Also, the Fleet Air Arm decided that heavy bombers should be able to take off from it, which meant that the deck had to suddenly be 2,000 feet, or 610 meters long. Steering also caused concerns, as originally they wanted to just steer it by varying the speed of the motors on either side, but the Royal Navy demanded there be a rudder. Given the size that this thing was supposed to be, the problem of mounting and controlling a rudder that would be 100 feet, or 30 meters high, was never actually solved. There were a lot of other practical concerns with the ship as well, as it would be rather slow and probably pretty inefficient in general. The whole project was cancelled when it was realized that the full-size vessel would probably cost more money and machinery than a whole fleet of conventional aircraft carriers. Cultivator number 6. Good lord, what is that? Is it designed to eat people? Well, okay, it's probably worth saying, and I admit this, that in the technical sense, this isn't a weapon. So you could argue that me putting this on a list of failed weapons is wrong. But it was supposed to be used for warfare, to do elements of warfare. It may not have ever been in combat, but, you know, it's such a distinctive piece that I have no idea where else I'd ever put it. I just had to put it on here. So, Cultivator number 6 was developed by the British Royal Navy at the beginning of World War II. The machine was originally known as White Rabbit number 6, although the prototype of it wound up being dubbed Nellie, which is a cute name. Like I said, this isn't a weapon in the technical sense. It was lightly armored, though it had no offensive capability. What it was for was to dig trenches. It was a ginormous trench-digging machine. You see, early on in World War II, a lot of the European powers, particularly on the Allies side, both the UK and France, couldn't stop thinking about World War I. Keep in mind, in defense, it had only been about 20 years since that war had ended and now World War II was gearing up. The notion that you would need to dig trenches for trench warfare was something that they were all considering because they thought that this was going to descend into another trench warfare situation. World War II never ended up that way, though. World War II was fought completely differently, but back then there was major thought that they might need something to build trenches very quickly, so designing a giant machine to do that precise thing wasn't that unreasonable. It weighed 130 tons and had a length of 77 feet 6 inches, or 23.62 meters. Winston Churchill was fully behind the idea and encouraged work on it to continue well past the point when everyone kind of realized that trench warfare was not a thing that was going to happen. Not a single one of these wound up being used in combat. Additionally, they could only go a little over 3 miles per hour, or little less than 5 kilometers an hour. Either way, they were not fast in any way, and if they weren't being used for the one exact precise thing they were for, then they were quite literally useless. They had no purpose for them. They didn't need to dig any trenches. They just didn't have to do it, or at least not nearly as often and constantly as they had in World War I. The Windkanone, or Windkanone. I'm gonna warn you now, this is exactly what it sounds like, and it's Germany's fault. The Windkanone was meant to operate off the principle of shooting small but very powerful portions of rapidly rotating gas. These were effectively mini vortexes, and they were pretty stable for a long time. It was effectively shooting air at the enemy, but it was very concentrated air, like shooting little mini tornadoes in a weird way. They thought they could use it to shoot down low-flying aircraft, but the problem with this is that over time, over a very short distance actually, even the stable nature of these mini vortexes starts to dissipate rapidly. At close range, it was actually powerful enough to destroy a 25mm thick wooden board at a distance of 200 meters, which is neat and all, but is it going to work against aircraft? Well, no, not at all. To be honest, even if it could hit an enemy plane, the aerodynamics involved with planes would actually allow it to pass through this kind of air projectile with little to no effect. They still actually deployed it though, installing it on a bridge, but it never had any significant results, and by significant I mean it had no results at all. Perhaps it's an interesting idea, but like I said, it never worked. The Great Panjandrum! Witness the awesome power of the rocket wheel. Now, when I say rockets in World War II, you probably assume I'm talking about Germany, but nope, this was the British again. Look at what you've done. What the heck is that? What is it? What's it for? I will tell you. The Panjandrum was a massive, rocket-propelled, explosive-carrying cart that was meant to help with invasions. The idea was that it could coast and roll over shallow water, and then reach the barricaded and heavily defended beachheads that they had to invade, and explode. And well, they could explode, but not the rest of it, really. This thing comprises of a steel drum that's filled with explosives, which is suspended between a pair of steel-treaded wooden wheels. The wheels were each a foot wide, and 10 feet in diameter. The weapon was propelled, like I said, by rockets, cordite rockets to be precise, that were attached to the wheels. Designers thought that with a full load of explosives, this thing could achieve a speed of 60 miles per hour, 100 kilometers per hour, which would be pretty fast, and with enough momentum to simply crash through any obstacles between its launch point and the target. The whole thing was secretly put together in Leytonstone, and transported by night to the testing grounds at Westward Ho, Devon. Really? The place is called Westward Ho? Let me check. That sounds ridiculous to me. Are you... What? Well, at least I can pronounce that, I suppose. Of course, this is the part of the video where you go down in the comments and say, actually, it's pronounced Weesward or something to throw me off. But the secrecy surrounding the project actually broke down rather quickly. The beach they used to test it was a popular destination for holiday makers, and every trial from the 7th of September 1943 onwards was witnessed by large citizen audiences, despite the DMWD's warnings concerning the safety of this particular weapon. The first test didn't utilize all the rockets that were meant to be attached to it. Well, had traveled a fair distance up the beach before a number of the rockets on the right wheel just failed, and the weapon careened out of control. Every test after that went pretty much the same way. It almost always lost control before it reached the end of the beach, even though every time they attached more and more rockets. Yes, that's the problem with this. It has nothing to do with the unpredictability of rockets. If we just add more of them, that will solve the problem. I promise. Eventually, one of the versions of the thing used a stabilizing third wheel and over 70 rockets. When this one launched, it hurtled towards the coast, like it was supposed to, and skimmed along the beach before it turned back out to sea. A number of the rockets detached and whipped around all over the place, almost striking some of the onlookers, and they exploded underwater. But they weren't done. This was going to work. Just add more rockets to it. That's worked so well so far. Well, they actually had a different idea this time. They removed the third wheel, and instead, they decided to add steel cables to the remaining two wheels as a basic form of steering to kind of keep it on the correct path. Of course, the Panjandrum was not to be contained. The cables snapped and whipped all over the place, so that was good. They tried thicker cables, they tried heavier rocket clamps, and the requirements for the thing were actually dropped a little bit. The Panjandrum no longer needed to be precise. It just needed, please, to be able to travel in the general direction of the enemy. Just generally, it's make it go one way and stay that way. Okay, can they do that with the final trial in January of 1944? No. No, they cannot. The Panjandrum will not cooperate. Like most of the other tests, at first it seemed fine, but then one of the clamps gave way, and at least two of the rockets broke free. The Panjandrum lost control and almost killed a group of onlookers. It was a failure, is really where we're at with it. As a result of that particular test, the whole thing was cancelled. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sundew 267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Twin Fox, Dimeblade 17, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Alaric Draspers, DM Tribal Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, and Ty Hammonds Jr. Till next time, this is Darkness, individual fond farewell.